Meanwhile, with each passing day, the threatening rhetoric between President Donald Trump in the United States and the leadership in Tehran seems to grow. And so now many on both sides are growing increasingly concerned that a large and drawn-out conflict in the Middle East is just over the horizon. While returning to the studio with additional analysis is Dr. Martin Sherman, the founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. And via Skype, please welcome Professor David Menashri, a leading expert on Iran from the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Thank you both very much for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Menashri, I'll actually begin with you. Is Iran really on the cusp of starting a drawn-out conflict with the United States, or do you think that, should we take Iran at its word, honestly, that it does not want war with the United States or with the West?
Well, I think at this stage it is important, but I think this is not the question. Let's assume both sides don't want war. Mm-hmm. And I believe that both President Trump and the government in Iran, they don't want war. But things can escalate in a matter of minutes to disastrous situation.
Well,
just one example from 30 years ago, when America was involved in the Gulf, and an Iranian civilian airplane was hit and led to tragedy. So these things can happen, and many wars in history started without both sides wanting.
I see. And so, yet the rhetoric is ratcheting up. Do you think that any one side is more to blame for that sort of rhetoric, for the hot words that are being kind of thrown across the aisle, or any sort of one nation's actions versus the other? Iran's malign activities, proxies, rocket launches, etc., versus the United States' deployment near the Persian Gulf. I don't know. What do you think is kind of driving this forward?
It begins when you want to begin. You want to begin in 1979? I believe not. You want to begin with President Trump's election? You want to begin with the more recent things? There is an escalation in rhetoric. President Trump viewed this deal as the worst in history and has withdrawn unilaterally from the nuclear deal. The Iranians, even when the deal was approved or before it was approved, they continued with their slogans, "Death to America," and they continued with their threats that America is the enemy and we'll fight with him. So this exchange of verbal and rhetorics reached a stage in which both sides now are stuck in the Gulf with threats that I hope will not materialize to put the whole thing in fire. It's going to be devastating for both sides. Both sides know, and I hope they will do whatever is possible to stop it and start from new beginning to discuss with each other.
Dr. Sherman?
Well, I think it's clear, given the nature of the Iranian regime, there's not going to be a consensual resolution to the standoff. The question is whether it will be coercive and kinetic or coercive and non-kinetic. The Iranians have already shown...
So you think either way it will be coercive, however?
It will only be coercive. The Iranians aren't going to wake up one morning, slap their forehead and say, gee, we've been doing the wrong thing, let's mend our ways. That's not going to happen. They have to be coerced either by threats which they bow to, or coerced through naked force. The Iranians have shown.
What about
the Iranians have shown that they are susceptible to pressure, which is what brought them to the table in 2015. Unfortunately, they had a very pliable U.S. regime negotiating with them, and they did produce this deplorable agreement, which basically gave them a pathway to a nuclear weapon at the end of the agreement, when the agreement expired, and gave them a free pass to do all sorts of other mischief across the world. So I don't think the Iranians have really internalized yet that there's a new sheriff in town, and they may be trying two things. They might be trying to call Trump's bluff or wait him out until the next election.
Okay, so assuming that their calling is bluff, are we going to maybe just see some more rhetoric, or is this just going to get worse? Professor Menashri, would you like to join back in?
Well, I don't know to call it a bluff on either side. I think Iranians are in devastating situation. The sanctions are really causing them problems, and they are, they want to show that they are powerful, proud, and stick to their policy. And they came with threats, and threats followed by threats on the other side. So I don't really understand what's going on here, and there is something more mature should intervene and try and calm down the tempers.
Well, America has shown that it can bring down any regime with very little cost, either in treasure or in casualties. It did it in Serbia. It did it in Afghanistan. It did it in Iraq. The problem began when America thought it wasn't enough to depose the regime, but to replace it. And of the $1 trillion spent in Afghanistan and Iraq, 95% of them was spent after the regime was toppled. So a very small portion of the cost of the war was involved in toppling the regime. Now, if the Americans internalize that lesson and say, we're going to topple the regime with military power by attacking infrastructure, dams, power stations, bridges, etc., I think that's feasible. And I think in Iran, which has basically a far more developed skeletal civil society, there is a reasonable chance that some more amenable regime will take over once the Ayatollahs have been deposed.
All right, well, guess we'll have to wait and see, as with many things in the Middle East. But in the meantime, Dr. Sherman, Professor Menashri, thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thank you.